Hi, so I'm gonna show you a quick tutorial, hopefully, that shows you the basics of applying a cloth physics procedural animation to an object and then exporting that animation, baking it essentially. So using an exporting process that bakes the cache, and then you can export as a glTF, ready for all sorts of fun applications. So this is just kind of your generic Blender at startup. I'm going to hit G and then Z to keep constraint on the Z axis. And so this is the cube that I want to apply the cloth physics to. It's going to kind of fall and hit the ground and then crumple. But I need a ground, so I'm going to hit Shift D and then return and then G, Z again. And then I'm going to hit S for scale and constrain the X and the Y. Oops. Sorry. Scale. And then we'll do Y now. Sorry. Still kind of learning my renegotiating Blender after teaching with Maya for so long. All right, so now what I need to do is apply the physics to my cube. But maybe first I actually want to give it an interesting texture so that we can kind of see what's going on. So I'm going to go into my materials tab and I'm going to say new texture, and I'm going to name it cloth, and I'm going to delete this default material from the cube. And then I'm going to give it a node for the base color with an image texture. And I can go into my shading tab and get my graph editor. I can select this and hit X. I can also do a Shift A for add and then search for image texture here, and then add the image texture node. I want to connect the color out to the base color, and I'm going to open a file. What do I want? Oh, how about this Cadre 1984 poster? Open image, and I can see it's kind of wrapped around the cube, but if I wanted to map that a little bit more closely, I could go into my UV editing, and I'm going to box select and figure out where I am. I'm upside down here. I think this is what I'm looking at. So I'm going to hit R for rotate, and then S for scale, and then G. Actually, different. R again. There we go. G to grab it. Other way. There we go. There we go. That looks pretty good. And then I can hit tab back into my object mode, or I could go toggle between my edit and my object mode from this drop-down menu. All right, I'm happy with that. I'm gonna go back into my layout view, and I'll grab this window. See my time slider, grab it, just give me a little bit more real estate down here. We're going to be playing through the time slider, and then I'm going to apply the physics. So I'll need to do two things. First, I'm going to apply the cloth physics to my cube, and I can do that in a couple different places. I can go into my modifiers and add a cloth physics here. But this isn't where I get most of my options. Most of my options are going to be in my physics tab. So go down into my physics tab here, and I can see that I have my cloth turned on. I can turn it on and off with that little X button, or add the cloth physics here. I'm going to turn the quality up a little bit, and then I'm also going to turn the mass up a little bit, like 3 kilograms. You can play around with these like tension, compression, shear, and bending. Well, they'll all kind of make modifications to the way like cloth interacts. So when I press play, I see it just drops right down through the floor. That's because I need to add a collider physics property to my floor. So I'm going to select my floor, click on collision. I'm just going to use defaults for now. And now when I press play, the box just sits there like a big dumb box. And that is because I don't have any joints in my box. So if you'll remember from my UV editing, all of these faces have no vertices. So I'm going to go in and add some vertices. I'm going to select my object, press tab to go into edit mode. I can also do that over here. Go into edit mode and then right click and subdivide. I'm going to do that a couple times so that I have enough bendy vertices. No, too many. Let's be realistic, Rhonda. I'm going to hit tab again, go back into object mode. And now I've got some crumple behavior. That's actually pretty crumply. So I might go in and it looks more like water than cloth. So what I'm going to do is go back into my physics tab here and make some adjustments. So let's see here. We'll say tension 5, compression 5, and bending 0.1. And I'll drag back and reset. I think that's maybe worse. No, there's a little bit more going on there. Let's see if I increase the tension again. And what happens? And I don't know my physics properties, so I just guess at a lot of stuff. Probably like most of us. Let's see what else. Stiffness, there we go. Compression, shear, bending. Oh, you know why I need to turn on self-collision. So it's allowing itself to, no, it's got out here, self-collision. So I want I want the object to not be able to pass through itself. So with that turned on, we should be getting a little less of like a flat paper puddle action happening here. It starts calculating slower too, because not only is it calculating the collisions with the plane, but it's now calculating its kind of like internal collisions, vertices to vertices. So that looks a little bit better. So now what I'm going to do is press stop, and let's see, 250 frames. That's fine. If I wanted to do this really fast, maybe I do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Maybe I'll just calculate it out to 150 frames. So I'm going to say end at 150 frames, and go into my cache settings. So this is like saving all of the frames. Down here we see where it's blue. That means it's been calculated. It's going to save temporarily to a cache, and I'll bring it back. Anytime you make edits, it'll like rewrite the cache if it loops. So you have to start on the very first frame and then loop through to the very end, and that'll give you a full cache. And after it does that loop through once, it's kind of temporarily saved until you make another adjustment. So let's go ahead and pause this. And we're going to save our file. So save as, I'm going to call this, where are my downloads? That's great. RH, Fi, cloth, test, one. All right. There we go. So it's going to be using this kind of local path and in the library where it's saving all of our temporary files, like all of our autosaves and all of the kind of temporary files associated when you're editing in Blender. You can tell it to save to the disk. That is, you can get into trouble there because it will save it out every time you make an adjustment. So you can end up with a ton of cache files that are saved to you locally to your hard drive. I don't recommend doing that unless you have an infinitely large computer and you're really worried about, you know, the cache. Like if you have like a big complicated animation and you really only want to do it once, like the cache calculation once, maybe that makes sense. But for most of the time when you're like still editing all your preferences, you don't want to, you want it to be temporary and you want to be able to write over it. Okay, so there we go. So now you can see once this kind of little purple line is down here, those are frames that have been cached. So it's now playing back much more quickly. Okay, so I've kind of started a part 2, and I forgot to do something that's really important. It's a feature of the export process in Blender into New Art City. And that is, you might have noticed when you import things into New Art City, like the handles might be a little bit off. So it becomes really tricky to like move things around. Let's see if I can, yeah. So like these cubes here, move back a little bit here, were exported together, or even here. So when I roll over the center of this 3D scan, I see that the handles are kind of like off center, right? And that is because the New Art City, the way that it activates an object is like by moving, like when your cursor is over the center of an object. But the way that the handles work is that they kind of roll off pretty quickly, right? So you're kind of constantly trying to chase like the handles to like grab it, and you have to like move your kind of point of view so that the center of your screen is on top of the handles, and it can be like a real pain. And the best way to manage that is to have an origin that is like the center of the object. So that's what I've done here with this cube. I've exported the origin of my object is the center, in the center, and then that way when I roll over it, I don't have to worry about it. I think that kind of happens by default in Maya, but in Blender, the world origin, or like 0, 0, where the grid matches up, is where the kind of like sender lies with the exported glTF. So I'm going to show you how to hopefully fix that. So back in Blender, this little orange dot represents the origin for each object, right? So if I select my floor, that has a little orange dot, and the gimbal handles for like all the transform tools are focused on the object's origin. But we also have a world origin, so like a global origin, and the global origin is what these numbers are in relationship to, right? So the local origin, if I switch from global to local, well, it actually doesn't change because I haven't applied any transformations, but Blender allows you to do something like applying transformations so that I can actually change this origin to 0, 0, so that it shows up 0, 0, 0 locally, but is still at the same position globally, which is a little bit funny. It has to do with why we have this cursor. The workflow in Blender is kind of changing a little bit, so I don't think most people like end up doing those kind of like applied transformations. Anyway, I digress. But what that translates to is that funny cursor asymmetry in New Art City when we do our export. So what we're going to do is, like in my, if you watch my path constraints tutorial, in order to, before we applied the constraints, we set the object to 0, 0, 0. So I'm going to do the same thing here. So 0, 0, and 0. And then I'm going to go into my side view here, and I'm going to press N to get rid of my my transform window, and for tools or transform window. And then I'm going to go into my side view. So let's go into my dynamic viewport and right side. And yeah, that looks good. Like I'm happy with that position of the floor in relationship to my cube. So it will fall and hit that floor. And then I'm gonna calculate out the cache again for the physics simulation. So I'm gonna do that, and I'll probably, yeah, it's not too bad. Might need to wait it out. So what we're doing again is calculating that temporary cache, and then what I'm going to do is use that third-party plugin to go ahead and bake that cache into keyframes. So in New Art City, that animation, because like the cube moves, the origin is going to stay in the same place, but it will help us in that kind of like animation loop to like roll over the center viewport so that the center of the cursor is aligned with the center of the gimbal, which is just, I know it can be tricky in New York City. All right, so I can see down here in my viewport window that I've got my little purple bar, yay, and sometimes it needs to go through twice before it kind of saves out the cache. Wonderful. All right, so now I've got the cache saved out. I can tell because the frames per second are kind of, you know, more or less real time. I'm going to pause this and then pull that back. And we're going to export, move that back. We're going to export this now for that keyframed cache. But before I do that, I'm going to say file save, and then I'm going to file save as. And every time I do this, I want to make sure, every time I bake, I want to make sure I'm saving to a new file. So I call this test3 baked. That way I've just saved, you know, my file with all the physics and the constraint settings, and now I can do whatever I want and kind of overwrite those with keyframes, and I have something to refer back to. So the first thing I'll want to do is make sure that my plugin is turned on. So under Edit and Preferences, Add-ons, go into New, and make sure the Import Export New Tech MDD format is checked. Then I'm going to go down to my hamburger and say Save Preferences. And now I can export this file, Export MDD. And that's fine, that looks good. Where's that? Downloads. And now I'm going to import that file. So this is my keyframed cache file. So it's basically like a keyframe version of this little blue line. So say File, Import, Lightwave Point Cache, MBD, and there it is. And there's all my keyframes. So if I press play, I see the same thing, which is good. And now it's still kind of, you know, calculating out. The physics is still calculating out. So, but I should be able to, now that I have this keyframe data imported, just delete the cloth simulation, which is why you want to make sure that you've got your data, why we do this kind of like baked version of the save, right? Because now if I'm not happy with it, that's all. Like I'd have to redo the simulation, go back to my bake file. But it's good that I have that. Okay, so now I've got the object with keyframes, and now I can export it as a glTF. So I'm going to say export glTF, and I'm going to use the glTF embedded, and I want to include my selected objects. I'm going to make sure my Y up is turned on. Geometry, modifiers, apply modifiers, UVs, normals, vertex colors, materials, check, check, check. And then animation, I want to include animation, and I want to make sure I include my shape keys. The shape keys are those keys that came in as that .mdd file. And then I'm going to say, that looks good, export glTF. It'll probably take a little bit of time. It's a lot of data. It's going to be a big file, but once we've exported the shapes and import it as a glTF, we can kind of play around with some like face reduction. So I'm going to let that run, and I'll be right back. Okay, so my glTF just finished exporting. So I'm going to say File, Save, go to File, New. This is in a new general. And here's where I'm going to just test my glTF file. So File, Import, glTF, and where was it? Downloads. There we go. You can see it's 60 megabytes, right? And so if you're trying to optimize, I mean, this cube had a ton of faces, but like depending on your application, this is not, you know, a small file. Awesome. All right, so we've got our collapsed little little QB friend. It's at 0, 0, 0. Now let's see what it looks like when we import. Oh, I messed up. That's all right. Or maybe that's just this file. So the min in general. Yeah. So the keyframes end at 150. I opened a new file and I forgot. Anyway, long day. So let's go back into New Art City and let's see. I'm gonna have a version of it that had the asymmetrical handles that I didn't like. And then let's say upload. Okay, so it's finished uploading. I have a beautiful little preview of it. I'm going to say RH by cube. And let's say preview. It's a big file, so it definitely needs some optimization. All right, so I've got my little crumple here. Beautiful. And the handles are still a little funky. So let's see. There we go. So it's fine when it's like you've got to catch it. You've got to catch it when it's like raised. So this is like just something to consider, right? Like when you've got your animations, the origins aren't moving with your animations. So it's because it's dependent on the mesh, which might be something to consider for New Art City. So 178 crew, let's figure out how to use this so that it's not like viewport dependent, and how do we, like if something's animating, like you've got to like go back and like chase it, like that's, I don't know. Anyway, you can always like change the location of things, like hand coding with the XYZ. But all right, so that is the basics, and yeah. But for today, I think that's probably good. All right, take care. Thanks.